Before we actually jump in and start building game trees, I want to talk a little bit about defining problems. Whenever I think about actual problem solving or structuring our problems in order to actually come up with a solution, I always think of this quote by Steve Jobs. And he says, if you define the problem correctly, you almost have the solution. Now, he's being a little bit simplistic when he says that here. Certainly, if we define the problem, we're not going to necessarily have a solution, or we may not even reach a solution. If we define a problem, we're not necessarily going to be almost at the point of a solution. We still actually have to go through and execute all of the steps within that problem-solving methodology to actually reach a solution. But I think what Steve Jobs is trying to say here is that too often, people skip this step. And I think that's somewhat systemic in a lot of different areas in life. People tend to skip this upfront step of fully mapping out and defining a problem, and they jump into actually starting to try to find a solution. And what ends up happening often is we lose sight of what that overall problem is, and we skip over key elements in the problem-solving process. So I tend to think that this is something that is very important in all areas of life, particularly here, though, when we are actually trying to use a solver for some type of testing purposes, we need to first define and map out what it is that we're actually trying to solve. So, as I mentioned, I think people do just jump right in, and I talk to a lot of people about their use in solvers, and typically, everyone does this when they first jump into a solver for the first time. I myself was in that same camp. Instead of necessarily mapping out a test or an experiment, I just entered a bunch of inputs that looked okay based on a hand that I had played, and I put that into a solver to see whether or not I actually played that hand correctly. And that's not necessarily unique to me. It's something that, honestly, virtually everybody does when they first jump into solvers for the first time. They start diving into solvers, they start entering parameters, and they start hitting go. And they're ultimately trying to look for the output and figure out, are they playing the hand correctly, and can I mimic this solution in game? But as we've discussed in the first module, this is just an inefficient way to study. There's a seemingly infinite number of solutions to a particular problem in a solver. And by doing this, it's going to lead to some poor findings. As we've already just demonstrated, the solver outputs are going to depend on our inputs, and our assumptions that make up those inputs are going to be fallible. So we're never going to ultimately identify that true equilibrium of the solution. So if we spend our time trying to copy a solver solution, we're just copying the answers to a different test. We're copying the wrong answers to a test. And that's not necessarily going to be fruitful for your development as a poker player. I like this quote here by Robert Jackson, which says, "He who must search a haystack for a needle is likely to end up with the attitude that the needle is not worth the search." And you can kind of picture a solver solution or the right solver solution as trying to find a needle in the haystack. There's one possible solution out there and a seemingly infinite number of solves that are not necessarily that true equilibrium. So trying to find that individual needle in a haystack, you're probably going to end up with the realization that it isn't worth it to necessarily do so, and you're going to end up giving up and not necessarily realizing the true value and the true benefit of these tools. I do believe that there is a better approach, though. So rather than actually diving right into setting up a solve, the better approach, in my opinion, would be to, before building your game tree, first very specifically define the problem that it is that you actually want to answer. By trying to answer everything, so by just putting all of your parameters into a solve and seeing what the solve actually tells us, you're going to end up coming up with an answer to nothing. And it's not going to necessarily be additive towards your abilities or your skill set as a poker player. The more specific, though, however, that we can get with your problem statement and fully defining out what that we're trying to get out of a solver solution, the better off that you'll ultimately be and the more additive that it will be towards your growth as a poker player. So after stating out the question that you're actually trying to answer, you're next going to want to identify the inputs that you're ultimately going to need to manipulate and those that you're actually going to need to keep constant to find an answer. As I've mentioned here before, the value of what we can get out of solvers comes from looking at multiple solves together. It comes from seeing how input variations affect the output. So in order to do this properly, we're going to have to set up very meticulous tests where we are controlling certain variables and moving certain variables in order to see how the solver reacts to the changes in variables that we've actually set up. Now, there's a lot of different problems that we can actually formulate here within solvers. There's really honestly no limits to the types of questions that can be answered using solvers. If you can think of what question that you might have about a particular hand or a particular area of no limit hold'em, odds are that we're going to be able to devise a test using solvers or an experiment using solvers that can help us reach an answer or reach some type of set of concepts that's going to help us better define how we should be approaching a specific situation. But I do have some example problem statements to kind of get you in that right mindset of defining a problem, and I'll kind of list some of these here below. The first is, what is the actual bet sizing that will earn the most money against an average player in my 2-5 casino game? Notice how specific I got here. It's not necessarily what's the strategy that's going to earn the most money. It's what bet sizing is going to be the optimal bet sizing here. And it's also specific around saying that this is an average player in a 2-5 casino game, which is going to imply that that type of player is going to play a little bit differently than the best player in your 2-5 casino game, or an average player in a 5-10 game, or a 10-20 game, or so on and so forth. So understanding how specific you can actually get, that's going to impact the input parameters that we actually enter into a solver to help answer that question. Next one here might be, what concepts should I understand when constructing a continuation betting range on a range neutral board? Again, we're pretty specific with this. We're not focused on the advantageous boards or the disadvantageous boards. We're focusing on the boards in which both players have a somewhat comparable shares of the pot from an equity standpoint. We want to have an understanding of how should we ultimately be building our continuation range. So we're going into this solution with a specific question that we're trying to answer. If my opponent overfolds to draw completing turn cards, how should I adjust my turn strategy or my flop strategy? Again, very specific in what it is that we're actually trying to solve, and we can set up tests to answer this specific question. How should I adjust my big blind flop defense strategy against an opponent who continuation bets 100% of range? It happens all the time, right? We play in games where our opponents are going to c-bet with all of their range. We might want to know, how do we counter that? And we can answer that question using solvers. And how would that change if he or she opens wider than the average regular? Again, a question that is somewhat specific that we can change input parameters to help find an answer. Finally, what portion of my range would benefit from introducing a second bet sizing to my continuation bet strategy? Pretty specific here, but it's a more open-ended testing question that we might ask. And again, these can go on and on. We can come up with a lot of different questions that we ultimately want to ask the solver. But the point here is that we want to get very specific before we actually dive into structuring ourselves as to what it is that we're trying to solve in the first place. So that's what I'm going to do here. Over the course of the next few modules 3 through 5, there are going to be some examples that are interweaved throughout these lecture videos. And I want to kind of set the stage for what those examples might look like here in the context of our Module 3, Module 4, and Module 5. As I mentioned here, I'm going to use relevant examples to structure our solver exploration. And while there's a lot of complexity to the game, I think we can simplify the majority of scenarios here to these 4 scenarios in this grid on the right that can help align pre-flop action and position to a formation that we can study using solvers. So what we're going to look at here is these 4 scenarios, and I'll move my mouse over so we can see. We're going to look at these 4 grids. This top left grid is going to be focused on offense in position. And what that's going to refer to is we are on offense from a pre-flop standpoint, meaning that we put in the last raise pre-flop, and we are in position here. So this would refer to a scenario where we're the button and we open and the big blind defends. Looking at things from that button perspective is an offense in position. In these scenarios, our range is uncapped. We have a range advantage on the majority of boards. The out of position player is likely to check to us in a lot of scenarios, and we're going to generally have a high continuation bet frequency. Now, conversely, when we are offense and we are in position, we are always playing against someone who is defense out of position. So we can kind of move diagonally here. And in this exact formation, the button opens and the big blind defends. The big blind is the defender, meaning that the big blind put in the last passive action pre-flop by calling. And the big blind is also out of position for the hand. Now, the big blind here in this spot, the out of position defender here, has a capped range generally. The villain, meaning the button here in this case, because we're looking at things from the big blind's perspective, the button has a range advantage on the majority of boards. And we're generally going to check the majority of our range on all boards. Now, I mentioned one formation here. This is the button versus big blind formation, but we can really kind of extend this towards any formation here and say that we have an offense in position and we have a defense out of position. Conversely, we have another set of positions here where we have this offense out of position and the defense in position. And maybe we could think of this as a 3-bet pot where the button opens, the big blind then 3-bets, and then the button defends by calling. So in that case here, the big blind would be the out of position offensive player, and the button would be the in position defensive player. The offensive player is generally going to have an uncapped range because it's unlikely that the offensive player is going to be retaining some of the top end hands. It happens sometimes, but for the most part, the offensive player generally has an uncapped range by retaining all of the strongest hands in his or her range. The offensive player will generally have a range advantage on the majority of boards, but this doesn't happen as much as it would from an in-position standpoint. There are certain boards where it is much more disadvantageous to be out of position, even if we are the offensive player with an uncapped range. And as a result of that, our continuation bet frequency is going to depend a lot on board texture. The converse to this role here is the in-position defensive player, that button in that scenario, who will generally have a capped range. But this does happen occasionally here where the in-position defensive player will be able to retain some top-end hands in range to kind of reduce the capped nature of his or her range. The out-of-position player, the offensive player, is going to have the range advantage on the majority of boards. And as a result, we're often going to face a continuation bet from our opponent in this spot. So we're going to look at these examples within these next few modules. And I'm going to actually split this up between GTO Plus and PioSolver. So I will use GTO Plus for the in-position offense and out-of-position defense examples. And I'll use PioSolver for the out-of-position offense and in-position defense examples. I'm going to focus on neutral flops where neither player has a massive range advantage, just so we can actually demonstrate a variety of scenarios. Because what you'll find as you start diving into solvers, if there are certain boards where one person has a much larger range advantage than the other, what typically ends up happening is the solvers recommends that we just generally bet everything as the advantageous player or check everything as the disadvantageous player. To demonstrate examples on later streets, so such as turns and rivers, I'll start with these same scenarios within modules 3 through 5, and I'll just make assumptions for how range construction will carry forward across those streets. And then for each example, we'll first clearly define the problem that we're trying to solve within the confines of the overall structure of our analysis. So let's just go through the problems that we're ultimately trying to solve, and then we'll shift gears and move into the upcoming videos within this module where we're actually going to dive into solving these problems through PioSolver and through GTO Plus. So let's start with our GTO Plus example, the button versus big blind single raise pot. And we're going to use a board of 964 rainbow. Our primary question here from the button perspective as the in-position offensive player is how should we be constructing a single bet continuation bet strategy on this board. Now we have some other details which will show on the pots that we have this is going to be modeling a 200 big blind game. Our effective stacks are going to be 197 big blinds, where the pot size is going to be 6.5 big blinds. So in our scenario here, the button opens to 3 big blinds, the big blind calls, and the small blind folds. That yields an SPR of about 30.3 to be exact, and the button is going to have a slight equity advantage over the big blind, 51.7% to 48.3% in this scenario. We have some assumptions and observations about this particular spot. So again, we're going to assume that this is a 5-10 cash game. And in this scenario here, we're going to use, it's going to be of a timed rake model. So we don't necessarily have to worry about rake in this particular example. Our big blind is a break-even recreational player. So he or she is going to be studied enough to understand high-level range concepts, but is not going to necessarily be 3-betting from the blinds enough, particularly with weaker hands. And we can account for that in our range construction and entering inputs. The big blind's also not going to be check-raising enough at the appropriate frequencies post-flop. This is also an extension of that read from number 2. And when we get into profiling, we'll talk about this. But oftentimes when we see recreational players, they're not going to necessarily be check raising enough or just taking aggressive actions as frequently as they probably should be doing so. And finally, the big blind is going to be sticky and inelastic to price with hands that connect with this board on the flop. But they're not going to necessarily continue past turns without good equity. So we can take that into account with some of our node locking into module 5, in that the big blind may over defend a little bit too much or defend appropriately here on the flop, but is going to release a lot of those hands on turns. Looking at this conversely through the big blind's perspective, I can ask the question, well, how should I adjust my big blind flop defense strategy against an opponent who continuation bets with 100% of range? Now, the other details are essentially the same here, with one marked difference here, is the sense that we are actually in this game modeling a 2-5 cash game with 10% rake up to $8. Now, what that does actually here, and I'll mouse over just so that you can see, is in the 5-10 game, the small blind is exactly half of the big blind. So we would left with a pot size of 6.5 in the other example. However, in a 2-5 cash game, our small blind is actually 40% of the size of the big blind. So our pot size actually goes down slightly to 6.4 big blinds. And that bumps our SPR up slightly to 30.8. So just noting that in our solves, it's not going to make a massive difference in the output, but it's something that we want to note, and we want to make sure that we're accurate with the way in which we're modeling this particular hand. So I did mention here that our first assumption, our first observation, is that we are playing a 2-5 cash game where rake is a factor in this game. So the casino is taking 10% of the pot up till $8. We could also convert that $8 to say that the casino is taking 10% of the pot up to 1.6 big blinds, which we'll see as we start entering the game details. Our button is a professional player. So we're looking at this from the big blind's perspective. The button, according to our observations here, is a professional. We've seen him or her at the casino playing regularly, often has a fairly big chip stack. As such, we'll also, along the lines of being a professional player, we'll also expect the button to err on the side of aggression. And the last point that we have here is that the button has lost a few pots in the last hour and appears to be somewhat visibly irritated. So we'll incorporate all of that when we start modeling out and building things in GTO+. Now let's go to the PioSolver examples, and this is the out-of-position offense, in-position defense examples. And we're going to look at a big blind 3-bet pot versus a button. We're going to use this board, which is a little bit of a different board, but it's still a somewhat range neutral board of a 10-5-4 two-tone board where the 10 and the 5 share the same suit. And we're looking at this first from the big blinds perspective, the out of position offense perspective. The question that we have here is, how should we be building a continuation bet strategy against a sticky opponent when we're out of position? In this spot here, as we remember from PioSolver, we can't enter decimals into the effective stacks and the pot size. So I've multiplied everything by 10 here. We're assuming this is a 5-10 game. And you can just picture this in big blinds times 10. So our effective stacks are 189 big blinds, but you can picture that as 1,890. Our pot size is 225 or 22.5 big blinds. So the way this math works out is the button opens to 3, the big blind 3 bets to 11, and the small blind folds and the button calls. So the big blind's 3 bet is to 11 big blinds, the button calls that, giving us 22 big blinds in there, and the small blind folds after putting in 0.5 big blinds. That yields us with an SPR of 8.4. Now the big blind is going to have a little bit more of an equity advantage in here, but that's going to be neutralized by the fact that the big blind is out of position in this hand. Our assumptions and observations here. So first, we're back to a 5-10 game where this is a timed rake scenario. So we are not taking rake out of this pot and putting that into this solution. Our button is a professional. We've seen him playing stack, is played often in this casino, and is a well-known professional in this casino. The button is a bit sticky and does fight for pots, particularly when in position, which is a good quality of buttons, which is a good quality of professionals, and something we often see when a professional in position is going to fight a lot for pots and will be a little bit sticky at times. So this is going to impact the way in which we want to construct that continuation bet strategy as the out of position player in the big blind. And then finally, looking at this example from the buttons perspective, so an in-position defense perspective, how differently should we be changing our defense strategy against an opponent who only 3-bets top-end value hands? We have the same details about the hand as we had before, but we have some different assumptions and observations. First, we are still playing this 5-10 game again, and we are still playing a timed rake game again, so we're not going to account for rake in this calculation. Our big blind who 3-bet in this spot now is a recreational player who does not 3-bet widely enough. Now this is important to note that our big blind is not going to be 3-betting as often, and in addition, the big blind's also going to be skewed much more heavily to a top-end linear 3-bet range with less bluffs in his or her range when they're actually 3-betting. So again, something that we will want to account for when we're entering data into our solver to be able to determine how we should be building a strategy against that particular opponent. So now that we've gone through these 4 examples, we're actually going to start diving into them as we start introducing some of the concepts throughout the rest of modules 3, modules 4, and module 5. In the next video, we'll start with the basics of entering our game details, and we'll talk about some of the considerations that we need to make when doing so. And then we're going to jump into the solvers themselves and start building out game trees. I'll see you there.